It is the 10th year after the migration to Medina. For 23 years, the early Muslims lived through a period of intense persecution, exile, and struggle within the Arabian Peninsula. Now, that period of isolation has ended. Over 100,000 companions have converged from across the expanding Muslim world, filling the Urana Valley. They have gathered at the base of Mount Arafat to perform the Hajj pilgrimage, the final requirement of their religious duty. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, sits astride his camel, al-Qaswa, preparing to address the crowd. Delivering a speech to a crowd this size requires a human relay. As the Prophet Muhammad speaks, men with powerful voices are stationed throughout the valley to repeat his words sentence by sentence, carrying the message to the furthest edges of the assembly. Though the community had recently seen great expansion, the Prophet's words do not focus on military victory or tribal dominance. "O people, lend me an attentive ear," he begins, "for I know not whether after this year I shall ever be amongst you again." To his closest companions, the tone is unmistakable. The Prophet is giving public notice of his own impending death. This single phrase changes the nature of the pilgrimage. It is no longer just a ritual. It is the final transfer of theological and social responsibility from the messenger to the people. The address moves the focus from the regional establishment of the faith toward a social and legal framework intended for all people, regardless of time or location. To understand the weight of his words, we have to look at the era preceding them, the days of ignorance, or Jahiliyyah. This period in pre-Islamic Arabia was defined by rigid tribalism, economic exploitation, and generational blood feuds. Speaking to the vast crowd, the Prophet explicitly declares that these customs are now entirely abolished. He describes these practices as being placed under his feet, metaphorically trampled into the dust. He issues his first major decree, the cancellation of all ancient blood revenges. This action shuts down the cycle of tribal retribution. His second decree targets economic exploitation. He dismantles existing financial structures by canceling all injury and unjust debts. In place of these systems, he establishes a new foundational rule, the absolute, inviolable sacredness of every individual's life, property, and reputation. By removing ancient debts and blood feuds, the sermon provided the necessary starting point for a civilization based on equity rather than tribal retribution. He then introduces a concept that directly challenged the rigid tribal hierarchies of the 7th century, absolute human equality. He reminds the crowd that all of humanity descends from a single creator and a single father, Adam. He states that an Arab has no merit over a non-Arab, nor a white person over a black person, except in their level of piety and the quality of their actions. To bind this community together, he reinforces their shared religious obligations. He instructs them to maintain their daily prayers, fast during Ramadan, give their wealth in zakat, and perform the Hajj if they are able. He pairs these pillars with specific duties toward one another. He warns the companions not to inflict injustice upon themselves, and commands them to strictly honor and protect the rights of women. He defines them not as property, but as partners and committed helpers. By defining women as a trust from God rather than an asset belonging to men, he provides a new legal basis to challenge the pre-Islamic customs that had governed the region for generations. This framework moves the measure of human value away from ancestry and tribal standing, anchoring it instead in moral action and mutual brotherhood. Knowing his time on earth is short, the Prophet leaves the believers with a final set of instructions to follow after his passing. He tells them to hold fast to two sources, the Qur'an and his own example, the Sunnah. Turning to the crowd of 100,000, he asks a final question. He wants to know what they will say when Allah questions them about his work on the Day of Judgment. The crowd responds in a unified roar, bearing witness that he successfully conveyed the message and fulfilled his mission. In response, he raises his index finger to the sky and then points it back at the people, asking Allah to bear witness to their testimony 3 times. Immediately following this moment, the final major Quranic revelation is recorded. Verse 3 of Surah Al-Ma'idah declares that the religion is now perfected, the divine favor is complete, and Islam is approved for the people. While the crowd rejoices, Umar ibn al-Khattab begins to weep. He understands that a mission declared perfected by God means the Prophet's time on earth is coming to an end. Before descending from his camel, the Prophet issues his last earthly command. Those who are present must convey this message to those who are absent. The farewell sermon acted as a catalyst. These principles of justice and submission have shaped the ethical standards of billions over 14 centuries, continuing into the present day. By the time the caravan finally returned to Medina, the Prophet's health collapsed. He was struck by a severe fever and blinding headaches that left him confined to his quarters. Soon he grew too weak to even stand. Breaking years of precedent, he instructed Abu Bakr to take his place and lead the community's congregational prayers. In a rare moment of temporary strength, the Prophet emerged one last time, supported on either side by Ali and his uncle's son Fadl. He made his way into the mosque, literally dragging his feet through the dirt, because he lacked the strength to lift them. As his condition worsened, a chaotic scene unfolded near his deathbed. He asked for a pen and paper to dictate a statement that would keep the community from falling into error. But the room fractured into a panicked debate, with some arguing the Prophet was too fragile to be strained further, until he finally asked them to leave. The sight of his failing health forced the community to realize they were about to be left alone. The question of leadership had shifted from a distant debate to an immediate, brutal crisis. On June 8, 632 CE, resting his head in his wife Aisha's arms, the Prophet looked upward and whispered his final words, "To the highest abode." The news triggered immediate chaos. Umar, a towering figure known for his fierce temperament, drew his sword and threatened to strike down anyone who dared claim the Prophet was dead. The shock was simply too massive to process. It was Abu Bakr who broke the paralysis. He went straight into the Prophet's quarters, uncovered his face, and kissed him. Stepping out to the panicked crowd, he delivered a stark reality check. He announced, "O people, if any among you worshipped Muhammad, let them know that Muhammad is dead. But whosoever worshipped God, God is alive and will never die." In a matter of seconds, the community was forced to sever its reliance on a living founder and stand on its own. Despite ruling over the entire Arabian Peninsula, the Prophet left behind a shockingly meager material inheritance: a white mule, some basic weapons, a small plot of land designated for charity, and 7 silver dirhams. His spiritual inheritance, however, was truly monumental. He left behind a complete theological blueprint, the verses of the Qur'an, and his Sunnah, the recorded example of his actions. His physical absence immediately threw the region into turbulence, sparking complex, centuries-long debates over political succession that still shape the geopolitical map today. Yet, underneath the political fractures, the core of the mission held firm. In his final days, the Prophet locked in an ethical and theological code that survived his mortality, a blueprint that continues to guide billions of lives.